Europe Out Loud, a podcast about Europe's history, culture, and civilization. Brought to you by the Martens Center, with Federico Reo.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Europe Out Loud, the Martens Center podcast series that tries to bring European history, culture, and civilization to bear on problems of contemporary EU politics. Today, we decided to discuss briefly the status and importance of culture and heritage as such in the European Union, and to argue that a stronger attention of the EU and a stronger place of culture and heritage in EU policies would be justified. That the EU could do more and should step up its action in this important field. But perhaps it is best to start from the definition of cultural heritage. What do we mean by cultural heritage? And I think we can go with a simple definition of cultural heritage as everything a group or society has inherited from past generations and that it deems of value. This it deems of value is important because it signals the fact that not everything we have inherited from past generations is heritage. In order to be heritage, it should be something that we think contributes to defining our way of being, our identity as a group, as a society. Now, this can be a variety of different types of things. It can be tangible heritage, things like buildings, monuments, books, works of art. It can be very intangible things like folklore, traditions, languages, dialects. It can be even natural heritage. Think about beautiful landscapes or even biodiversity, so much of which we have lost due to climate change in the last few decades, in the last half century, really. So the EU is already involved in this field. There are a number of symbolic and important activities and policies that it is involved in. I could mention here the European Heritage Awards, for example, the European Heritage Days, the European Heritage Label, and even the European Year of Cultural Heritage, which was a significant success a couple of years ago. But arguably, and this is the main argument of the podcast, more can be done, more should be done, also in light of the great challenges to which our continent's heritage has been exposed in the last couple of decades. So let me give you some reasons for that. The first reason is that, in fact, we tend to overlook it, but culture and heritage are important EU values according to the treaties. This is often neglected, but there are important provisions of the treaties giving great prominence to cultural heritage. Let me start maybe from the common provisions. So the provisions of the treaty that have a more programmatic nature. The preamble of the Treaty on European Union as modified by the Lisbon Treaty, so the very beginning, if you want, of the treaty, refers to drawing inspiration from the cultural, religious, and humanist inheritance of Europe. If you then read further a little bit, you go to Article 3, which is a very central article in which some of the key aims of the EU are defined. And it is said that one of the EU's key aims is to respect its rich cultural and linguistic diversity and ensure that Europe's cultural heritage is safeguarded and enhanced. And this is just to mention a few common provisions. When we look at more policy-focused provisions, we find the same prominence. And here I should quote Article 167 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. It states, and I quote again, that the EU must contribute to the flowering of the cultures of the member states while respecting their national and regional diversity and bringing the common cultural heritage to the fore. There is even in the same article a provision stating that the Union shall take cultural aspects into account in its action under other provisions of the treaties, in particular in order to respect and to promote the diversity of its cultures. And this is an important provision because it is what has been called a cultural mainstreaming clause, meaning that it mandates the EU to incorporate the heritage and the cultural dimension in all EU policies. So there must be a regard to cultural diversity in all EU policies. So this is just to say that the status of culture and heritage in the EU treaties is very important, and probably the commitment of current EU policies to it is below potential, is below what the treaties would allow and would perhaps even require. I move to my second reason, which is a little bit more pragmatic. The first is almost legal, I would say, or treaty-based argument. The second reason is that cultural heritage has been exposed over the last decade to a very significant number of challenges that have taken on an almost existential dimension by now. The first obvious one is budgetary cuts. We are coming out of a decade of very heavy financial retrenchment, multiple financial and economic crises, the global financial crisis, the euro crisis, more recently, of course, COVID-19, which has had devastating economic consequences. Now, the fact is that when governments are short of money, they don't cut, obviously, and rightly, they don't cut basic services. They tend to slash budgets for culture and the heritage. And this has taken a big toll, especially, but not only, in the countries that have been most hardly hit by the crisis, the country of the Mediterranean, countries like Greece, Italy, Spain, even France, which happen to be not only the most hardly hit by some of the economic crises of the last years, but also some of the countries with the richest cultural heritage. So that's one aspect of the crisis that we have been facing. Another important neglected challenge is actually climate change. People tend to forget that climate change has a massive heritage dimension. We have now forecasts telling us, for example, that 75% of the sites in the Mediterranean basin are at risk of flooding due to rising sea levels. Other forecasts are telling us that 86% of those sites, so cultural heritage sites in the Mediterranean, are also at risk of erosion. So not only at risk of flooding. This is of course, massive numbers. Some of the images of cultural destruction that are brought about by financial cuts and climate change are very clear to our eyes. Let's think about Pompeii, this magnificent Roman city close to Naples that was buried under the ashes of the Vesuvium after an eruption. Or let's think about Venice. Everyone knows Venice. Well, Venice had been sinking 10 centimeters into the Adriatic Sea over the last century, and this is going on. It would be a mistake, by the way, to think that this is just limited to the Mediterranean countries, because the problem is much broader than that. The Netherlands, the important artistic cities of the Netherlands might be underwater in a couple of decades. Utrecht, Amsterdam, The Hague, Rotterdam, and so on. Even in countries which are more, say, in the hinterland of Europe, take the Czech Republic, there have been detected a very massive increase in rainfall that has had negative consequences, has damaged cultural heritage. For example, in central Prague, in a couple of occasions over the last 20 years. These many challenges are another important reason why there is a strong case, I think, for the EU to step up its action and to support the member states in defending cultural heritage. The third reason is, I would say, a more cultural political, and it is the change in the politics of cultural heritage. Over the last decade and even more, we have seen the rise of Eurosceptic right-wing populism in a number, well, really across the European Union. And it is a fact that the claim to be standing up, to be protecting a threatened cultural heritage at the national and regional level often is at the heart of the political rhetoric, at the very Eurosceptic, I should add, political rhetoric of these movements. We can think about the centrality, for example, of Jeanne d'Arc and French history in the rhetoric, in the political discourse of the Rassemblement National in France, or we can mention the insistence on Danish identity of the Danish People's Party, or even the obsession with ancient Greek civilization or Golden Dawn in Greece. So the evocation of a threatened national heritage is at the heart of this force's political discourse. And this is unfortunately accompanied by a very negative rhetoric about European integration. Now, in light of the provisions of the treaties that I mentioned before and the centrality, the cultural diversity and the heritage as in the EU treaties, of course, this is nonsense. This is totally unjustified. What has happened, however, and this is a fact since the 1990s, and particularly in the last decade, is that there has been a transformation in the concept of cultural diversity that is at the heart of EU cultural policies. What do I mean by that? Until the 1990s, cultural diversity in EU cultural policies mainly referred to diversity of national cultures within a European cultural unity. And this unity was, of course, meant to be manifested in a common heritage. So we can see that cultural diversity and heritage in this conception were two sides of the same coin. Since the 1990s, and for perfectly justified and good reasons, because our societies have transformed, have changed, the notion of cultural diversity has transformed, and it has come to mean much more diversity within the European societies, between each individual European societies, due to migratory flows and multi-ethnic populations. And this different conception, shall we say more progressive conception of diversity, has progressively replaced the older conception, heritage-based conception of diversity at the heart of EU cultural policies, and that's completely marginalized, or mostly marginalized, I would say, the heritage dimension. So I think what is important for the EU is to rebalance, to redress the balance between these two dimensions, which are both equally important. And in this sense, strengthening the heritage dimension can be a step in the right direction, because it will mean celebrating and protecting the specific national and regional historical heritage of the European states at the European level. And I think politically this could send also a powerful signal that the Union is close to the heritage and the identity of its member states and its member regions. Now, concretely, what does it mean? What could the EU do? Just before I move to my conclusion. Well, I would mention essentially three things. The first thing that needs to be done is to sort of make available a significant amount of funding to secure, to refurbish, to restructure the many sites across the Union which are now threatened with crumbling, with decay, and so on and so forth. And one possibility to achieve that would be to create a European Heritage Fund, it could be called like that, within the EU budget, whose purpose would be precisely to rescue heritage across the Union that is threatened. This would have to be dedicated not to the most iconic sites. This is an important detail. We are not talking only or even mainly about the Parthenon or the Colosseum or Notre Dame in Paris. We are talking about the many forgotten little sites that are neglected, that are abandoned, and they do not receive the same amount of media attention, but they nonetheless could benefit immensely from European support. So that's one aspect, one thing that can be done. Another thing that probably has to be done is to finance the transition, the modernization of the whole culture and heritage sector, which mostly relies on a very old-fashioned business model that has been very heavily hit now by COVID-19, simply because it is very much based on tourists, visitors fees, let's say. And this has meant that with the stop of the flow of tourists, these sites and these monuments have been facing significant financial difficulties. So they have to modernize, they have to go digital. They are one of the sectors, in fact, in which tradition and modernity, can be combined, can be married most happily. And here the EU can lend a hand in this direction. And maybe the last thing that I would mention, there are many other potential things, but let me mention one last important thing that the EU could do. One of the flagship programs of this commission, of the von der Leyen Commission, is the European Green Deal. Now, as I have said, there is a very strong heritage dimension in climate change. So if the Commission could reinforce the heritage dimension of the Green Deal, and maybe specifically dedicate some of the Green Deal money to addressing the heritage-related problems created by climate change, that would be, I think, a very important signal and a very important way to redress the balance of EU cultural policies in the direction that I was saying earlier. So I come to my conclusion, which really is about restating that now that the Union is strengthening itself in many ways, and that it is really making many steps in the direction of becoming a consolidated political union, it will need to be successful in this process to nurture a shared historical horizon, because there is no stable, viable political union without a shared historical narrative and a shared historical horizon. In a continent like ours, which is characterized by the diversity of its cultures, of its languages, of its traditions, this shared historical horizon can only be constructed if the Union step up its action in being seen as a protector, as as a force nurturing the culture and the heritage of each different country, of each different region that exists in its bosom. And I would like to end this short reflection by quoting the first ever document by any EU institution to deal with the topic of cultural heritage, which is a 1974 European Parliament report on the subject, drafted very symbolically, perhaps, by Lady Diana Ellis, who was a Brit. Of course, it's quite something to be mentioning that at the eve of Brexit, which is supposed to happen in less than 2 weeks. And Lady Diana Ellis defined cultural heritage as the wealth that transcends all political parties, all national frontiers, and all centuries, a cultural heritage which brings a deeper value and meaning to our daily lives beyond the economic, financial, and material considerations which saw beset us. It could have been written, I think, today in a time of crisis that is comparable, if not worse, in many ways to the 1970s. And I think we should keep it in mind when discussing heritage problems in the future. Thank you very much for your attention and for listening to this podcast.
That was today's episode of Europe Out Loud. Subscribe to our podcasts for more.